Good afternoon, and welcome to our second panel on imprisonment and persecution in Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, in this session focusing entirely on the Soviet period. My name is Jeremy Wiebe, and I'm an associate of the Center for Transnational Mennonite Studies here at the University of Winnipeg, where I work for the D.F. Plett Historical Research Foundation and teach in the history department. I did once attend the University of Manitoba. We have 4 presenters in this session, 2 presenting remotely. After I introduce them, they will give their presentations in the order listed in the conference program. This will be followed by a discussion period where you will have the opportunity to ask questions of the presenters. Werner Toews is a retired police officer and a former vice president of the Manitoba Mennonite Historical Society. He has published articles in several publications on Russian Mennonite themes and received the Germans from Russia Heritage Society 2017 Joseph S. Haidt Literary Award for his article on the missing records of the first Mennonite settlement in Russia. He is also the author of the book Sketches from Siberia that was published in 2018. Waldemar Masson, born in 1994 in Baden-Württemberg to a resettler family, has been engaged with his family history and the history of Germans from Russia since the age of 14. With Mennonite as well as Volga and Black Sea German roots, his genealogical research today encompasses a family tree of around 15,000 individuals. He studied education and art history in Erlangen, Bavaria, and Berlin, and completed his master's degree in art history in 2024. He works as an author and artist. Naemi was born in Karaganda, Kazakhstan, to a Mennonite family who were deported there during the Second World War. She grew up in Frankenthal, Germany, where she is a member of the large Mennonite Brethren Church. She studied history and literature in Mainz and worked in a Mennonite publishing company for many years, then studied social work. She now works as a social worker and does historical research in her free time. Alex Tepperman is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Winnipeg and was formerly a visiting scholar in Judaic studies at Brooklyn College. Alex is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Historical Criminology and co-editor of the collection Memory as Power, Historical Criminology and the Role of the Past in Critical Scholarship. He is currently developing his monograph, Jewish Fraud in London Since 1066, an Epochal History for Palgrave. I'm going to turn it over now to Alex. I'm going to turn it over now to Werner.
There we go. Hello, thanks for coming. I packed a lot of information in my 15-minute presentation, so everybody should pay attention because there's going to be a test after. On November the 4th, 1937, at 5 o'clock in the morning, a knock at the door signaled that their time had come. The fateful hour for my grandfather Nikolai Zuderman and his brother Heinrich had arrived. They dressed and packed some extra clothing, and just before they left, they were informed by the NKVD officers that they didn't need to bring a pillow or blanket as they would receive them in prison. A wordless goodbye was made to the sleeping children, and with that, they were gone. My grandmother Elizabeth and her 2 sisters, the 2 sisters of my grandfather, Anna and Katharina, stood around completely bewildered. The 3 women were in shock at the arrest of the 2 brothers. By now, the children were aware of what had just occurred. The only son of Nikolai, 7-year-old Henry, was shaken by the events that morning and was the first to speak. He said, "It would have been better if we'd all had died." My mother, who was only 5 years old at the time, had a faint memory of her father's arrest, but this event would haunt her for the rest of her life. On that fateful day, 68 Mennonite men from the city of Zaporozhye, Ukraine, and surrounding region were detained by the Soviet secret police. The mass arrests of hundreds of thousands of Soviet citizens occurred during the years 36 to 38 and famously called the Great Terror. On July 31st, 1937, Nikolai Yezhov, the head of the NKVD, signed an order that marked the beginning of mass repressions in the USSR. It signaled a large purge of the population, whereas earlier, only smaller operations had been ordered. Stalin's orders now dictated that the enemies of the state had to be eliminated, either by imprisonment in a labor camp or by execution. These large-scale repressions continued until November 1938. The Zuderman family later learned that the two brothers had been taken to the Zaporizhia prison. My grandmother was never allowed to visit my grandfather. After December 1937, my grandfather and his brother were never heard from again. Life went on, but without the two brothers, the remaining family members had to earn a living without the men. They would survive World War II and a journey to Germany. In 1948, they were fortunate enough to immigrate to Canada. 66 years later, the remaining Zuderman family would be notified of the true fate of the brothers. That notification would be made by me after I received a letter from the Red Cross in August of 2003. A very cold case. As a child, I listened to the stories of my family about the life they had lived in the former Soviet Union. The disappearance of my relatives intrigued me. I would spend many years investigating their disappearances. It was a cold case that needed to be thoroughly investigated. The family believed that the brothers had been taken to a labor camp and were imprisoned there. After the immigration to Canada, the remaining members of the Zuderman family settled into a new life. The fate of her husband weighed heavily on the mind of my grandmother. Sometime in the 1950s, my grandmother contacted the Red Cross. After waiting many months, she received a reply. The letter informed her that Nikolai had died in a labor camp after contracting dysentery. However, in 1967, Anna Zuderman, who had also contacted the Red Cross, received a letter with information on the third brother, Jacob. The letter revealed that Jacob, who had been arrested in 1934, died in camp in 1940. The letter also stated they were unable to trace the whereabouts of Nikolai and Heinrich. I later learned that the Soviet authorities had routinely sent false information to the families. Now I had more questions than answers. My search began in November 2002 when I contacted the Canadian Red Cross requesting information about Nikolai and Jacob. The first break in the case came in 2003 when I received a letter from the Red Cross. There it was, the cold hard facts. Nikolai David Zuderman had been arrested on November the 4th, 1937, accused of counter-revolutionary propaganda. On January the 9th, 1938, he was shot. But on November 30th, 1989, he had been rehabilitated. The letter also revealed that Jacob Zuderman had been executed on October 15th, 1937. The earlier versions of their fate were in total contradiction with this new information. Included in the letter was a sentence at the bottom which stated, "This case will now be closed." In my mind, this case was far from being closed. When I informed my mother of this new information, her first comment was, "Well, at least they didn't have to suffer in a camp." I also informed her that they had been rehabilitated, to which she replied, "What does that help now? They're all dead." The brief summary contained in the Red Cross letter was unsatisfactory. I was determined to obtain the police and court records for my grandfather. I continued with my research and inquiries to the State Archives of Ukraine for a number of years. During my research, I learned that in 1994, the Ukrainian government passed a law granting rehabilitated persons or their close relatives the following rights: the right to familiarize themselves with the materials of classified and criminal administrative files and receive copies of those documents. Governmental bodies were also obliged to inform relatives of the rehabilitated if such data was available in the location of their death. In 2006, I made a request to the State Archives quoting the details of the 1994 law. This was answered by a letter from the Ukrainian Embassy in Canada. The letter stated they could not provide me with any documents or photographs of my grandfather. Not satisfied, I contacted the official at the Ukrainian Embassy. He confirmed that I would not receive any documents and that people were no longer interested in this history. I assured him he was wrong. Success. The light at the end of the tunnel arrived in 2015 when the Ukrainian government enacted legislation that opened up the NKVD files for review by relatives and scholars. This law was almost identical to the one passed in 1994, but this time I hoped the files would actually be released to family members. In early 2018, I sent a request to the State Archives of Zaporizhia for copies of his police and court files. On June the 7th, success, I received 20 scans of the files via email. My journey to acquire my grandfather's court and police files appeared to be at an end. The records. Before I describe the contents of those files, I'll provide you with a quick summary of the Criminal Code of Canada pertaining to the arrest of a person and the rights afforded them. In Canada, the accused has a right to be informed of the reason for their arrest, informed of their right to counsel, and police caution. A police caution is a warning given to a person informing him that the right to remain silent and that anything they say may be used as evidence against them. This right to not answer any questions and the right to counsel are protected under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The accused are presumed to be innocent, and the onus is on the Crown Prosecutor to provide that person charged that they committed a crime. After having the documents translated, I reviewed my grandfather's case. The first document was the cover page of the case files. This page revealed these documents pertain to the prosecution of Nikolai Zuderman and 2 other men who were also charged under the Criminal Code of the Ukrainian SSR. Details of the charges were sabotage, Part 2, anti-Soviet propaganda and agitation, and participation in a counter-revolutionary organization. The next document, dated November the 4th, was a typewritten form completed by Sergeant Hugo Schultz of the NKVD, requesting permission to arrest and detain Zuderman at the Zaporizhia prison. After reviewing the materials, the investigator believed there was enough evidence to support the charges. The next 6 scans of documents are various forms signed by the department head of the NKVD, the head of the NKVD of Zaporizhia, and a state prosecutor authorizing the arrest and the charges. But it was still unclear to me what kind of evidence would support those charges. There was no information on whether my grandfather had been asked to speak with legal counsel or given a caution on self-incrimination. It also appeared that his case was adjudicated by a panel of 2 officials when my grandfather was not present. It appeared that his fate was based on the evidence of witness statements and a confession that he was guilty. None of the witnesses' statements were included in his file. During my research, I found the website of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. They are a central executive body that implements state policy in the field of restoration and preservation of the national memory of the Ukrainian people. On that website, I located an article titled "The Great Terror, Anniversary of a Tragedy." The article contained the following information. On July 10, 1937, the Politburo sent out a directive to the regions of the Ukrainian SSR to create regional troikas. That meant there was 3 members of that troika that would adjudicate the courses, and the 3 members were the head of the NKVD, the regional prosecutor, and the first secretary of the CPSU. This contradicted Soviet legislation as well as the 1936 Constitution. The accused were also deprived of the right to speak with counsel or to appeal the verdict by the troika. Psychological bullying and inhumane torture were permitted to gain a confession. These methods were sanctioned by the Central Committee of the All-Union Communist Party. Cases of wrongful conviction were considered permissible. To understand the suffering endured by the accused during the Great Terror, I located a book written by Lynn Viola titled "Stalinist Perpetrators on Trial." The book focuses on the work of the NKVD while engaged in the apprehension, prosecution of people suspected of anti-Soviet activity in Ukraine. The information was taken from the court cases of those officers that were charged with violating Soviet law during the terror years. A quote from the book. To prove the fiction of the terror, the NKVD had to provide a vast panoply of enemies who, once arrested, had to confess according to established tropes. Because the charges were fictitious, the police operatives had little choice but to extract confessions through force and create witness testimony through manipulation and threat. Chapter 6 of that book, An Excursion to Zaporizhia, focuses on the officers assigned to the city of Zaporizhia, where my grandfather had been imprisoned. It begins with an interesting quote by one of those officers. Without any exaggeration, I can say there was not one interrogator who honestly wrote up interrogation records. The book focuses on the events principally happening in 1938, long after my grandfather and his brother were executed. What occurred in 1938, however, was no different than the events in 1937. Interrogation. My grandfather was interrogated November the 21st and again the next day. Judging from these dates, it would appear that my grandfather was in custody for 18 days before he was interrogated. One can only imagine what kind of terror he suffered. The handwritten interrogation of my grandfather was included in the files. From the first question to the last, he admitted to guilt to being a member of a counter-revolutionary organization. My grandfather also admitted to causing damage at the collective farm by scattering grain in the fields, breaking the bones of a horse, and damaging some farm wagons. Based on those stories about my grandfather's personality, I suggested none of this happened. He was not the kind of person that would destroy property or harm an animal. The following day, the officer who interrogated him presented the formal indictment document to my grandfather. The document stated, Having examined the investigative materials, Zuderman Nikolai, German, is charged with crimes provided in the Articles of the Criminal Code. As a result of an investigation, it was established that citizen Zuderman was a member of a German fascist organization and promoted fascist propaganda. His signature indicated that he had read the document. My grandfather was interrogated on the next day. The only question asked was, do you confess to being guilty or committing crimes according to the Articles of the Criminal Code? His signature again indicated he read the document. My grandfather was interrogated, and his response that he was guilty. I will suggest that my grandfather's confession was pre-written, and all he did was sign the documents after being threatened and tortured. Caught in the Great Terror trap, he had no choice but to sign these fraudulent documents or face consequences. The Zaporizhia chapter of the Lynn Viola book describes the methods used to extract confessions. One method was the use of a rubber truncheon to beat prisoners. Another method was to place 30 to 40 prisoners in a jail cell designed to hold 6. After approximately 5 to 10 hours, most accused agreed to confess. I wonder why. Another threat could have been that the wives would be arrested and the children would be placed in orphanages. The next pages contained a summary of his case, written for the panel of 2 officials to review the summary and pronounce a sentence. At the bottom was the word confessed, and the signatures of the head of the department of the NKVD and the acting regional prosecutor. The next document indicated that he was sentenced to death on December 22nd, 1937, and the execution was carried out on January the 9th, 1938. The place of execution and the burial were not recorded. For many of the victims, the places of burial were kept secret, as were the names of the executioners. And finally, exoneration. The most important document to me was a 1989 review of my grandfather's files. The review was conducted by the State Prosecutor's Office of the Zaporozhye region. The prosecutor reviewed the case and found that my grandfather's case fit the criteria described under a decree by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet Union, proclaimed on the 16th of January 1989. This meant cases like my grandfather's qualified for additional measures to restore justice to the victims of repression during the periods 1930s, 1940s, and the beginning of the 1950s. These measures are the return of lost rights and benefits, the elimination of legal restrictions related to unlawful criminal prosecution, imprisonment, unjustified conviction of innocent persons, the unlawful use of compulsory medical measures, and the restoration of legal capacity for the future. In conclusion, it was obvious that my grandfather his experience with the Soviet justice system was markedly different than that of the Canadian justice system. Rest in peace, Opa. You are gone but not forgotten. Thank you.
So, good evening from Germany, especially from Berlin. My name is Waldemar Masson, and today I will tell about my family history. Persecution and hope, survivor strategies in a hostile regime, how my Mennonite family survived the Soviet Union. Yes, I hope you can see it. So, yes. I'm the grandson of Helena Sperling, who came from a Mennonite family on the Crimea. It was a time when every step was watched, every word carried weight, and distrust was part of daily life. My family lived between fear and hope, between bitterly cold winters and secret prayers, yet they managed to preserve their faith and identity, often only through resourcefulness, courage, and the strong bonds that held them together. This is the story of those who survived despite persecution, deprivation, and who left me, as a descendant, the gift of memory. With the founding of the Soviet Union in 1922, a time of suffering began for many citizens of the former Russia Empire, especially for the Germans. The parents of my great-grandfather, Peter Sperling, Johann Sperling, and Elisabeth Mirau, tried to immigrate to Canada with their 6 children. They lived in the village of Arnenfeld, Anovka, on the Crimea, where Johann worked as a veterinarian and also served as the village headman. The family owned 65 desiatines of land. A certificate issued by the Rayon administration of the Soviet Peace and Work Militia in the Jankoy district, dated February 26, 1923, confirmed that the family was allowed to leave Arnenfeld. Johann Sperling and his family traveled to Moscow to obtain their exit permits. There, they were supposed to undergo a medical examination to receive approval. However, the originally responsible doctor had already been taken by the regime, as my great-grandfather later recounted. So, the Sperlings went to another doctor. Margareta Sperling, the younger sister, was diagnosed with an eye condition. Even though she later worked as a teacher and never needed glasses. Because of this diagnosis, the emigration permit was denied, and the family had to return to Arnenfeld. What exactly happened that my great-grandfather never spoke of. In 1924, his mother Elizabeth died, and later that year, Johann married her younger half-sister Katharina Mirau. With her, he had five more children. In the 1930s, Stalin's purge reached the Crimea. 8 men from the village were arrested, deported, starved, or imprisoned. Johann Sperling was no longer allowed to serve as a village headman and was eventually declared as enemy of the people. The charges were flimsy. He belonged to the faithful and led the Mennonite Brethren congregation. In 1935, the NKVD searched the family home. They found suspicious letters from Prussia. Old connections considered contact with the class enemy. These were correspondences showing that Elizabeth's and Katharina's grandparents had once belonged to the Mennonite congregation in Heubuden near Marienburg, West Prussia. Although the Mirau family had emigrated to South Russia in 1842, they kept in touch with relatives. This correspondence preserved by Peter's grandfather, Peter Mirau, was occasionally read aloud at midday. However, in 1935, 2 letters were left open during NKVD search. That alone was enough to accuse Johann Sperling of illegal contact with foreign countries. By 1937, rumors spread that the Sperlings had weapons. My great-grandfather was the chairman of a local shooting club, but the weapons had been confiscated years later. At that time, he worked as a surveyor in the fields. When the NKVD searched in the house again, he was at work. Villagers warned him urgently not to return home. So he spent 2 weeks out in the open fields without shelter, while my great-grandmother Katharina Boschmann and other neighbors secretly provided him with food. On August 11, 1937, his father was arrested and deported to the Komi RSSR at the southern edge of the Arctic Ocean, far north in European Russia. The last message indicated that he was working there as a veterinarian. Years later, in 1942, the family received notice that he was prohibited from writing, an early hint that he was in fact no longer alive. It wasn't until the 1960s, at their place of exile in Karaganda, that they learned the full truth. Johann Sperling has been executed on February 13, 1942, officially for poisoning the livestock. He was posthumously rehabilitated on July 24, 1963. Yes, and this is a request of his wife when she asked where about her husband. Yes. The family of my great-grandmother Katharina Boschmann also suffered greatly. They too lived in Annenfeld and had once been well off. Her father her father Klaas Boschmann, like his father Cornelius Boschmann, had been a preacher. Klaas Boschmann married Helene Dirksen and had 9 children with her, including my great-grandmother Katharina. The Boschmanns owned land they had built through hard work and diligence. With the October Revolution and the subject of collectivization, they were classified as kulaks and disposed. They were effectually stripped of rights and status. The family was driven from their home and lost everything. The initial found shelter by their oldest son Cornelius Boschmann. The youngest son Abraham Boschmann was placed in care of the Sperlings, so he could earn something to keep his parents from starving. In 1929, the Boschmanns also tried to leave the Soviet Union legally for the last time. They sold their remaining possessions and traveled to Moscow to emigrate to Canada. Permissions was granted, and they were already on the ship when Stalin suddenly closed the borders. The Boschmanns had to return to Crimea and repurchase everything they had previously sold to the neighbors. The Boschmanns too were not spared Stalin's repressions. Every night the Black Raven, as the secret police were called, came for house searches. What they were looking for or found, no one knew. On the night of March 9, 1938, Klaas Boschmann was arrested. His granddaughter Elvira Kankeni-Rogalski recalls that he had carried her home on his shoulders that evening before. He was 60 years old at the time. On October 15, 1938, Klaas was executed. On December 23, 1938, his older son Cornelius was also arrested, but fortunately, he was later released. Peter Sperling and Katharina Boschmann, my great-grandparents, married in 1932 in Annenfeld. That same night, my great-grandfather was drafted into military service. My great-grandmother and his father visited him often as possible. In 1936, their first daughter Nina was born. In 1940, the second daughter Lilia followed. Yes, and this is a photo of my great-grandfather in the military service in the 30s. On the evening of August 16, 1941, the heads of the families were called to the village council, where they received a fateful order. Within 24 hours, everyone had to be at the train station. Each person could only take 50 kilograms of luggage. The cows had to be handed over to the collective farm, and houses' keys left at the village council. This order affected 53,000 Germans from Crimea. By August the 17th, at 1 p.m., they had to be ready. Most horses had been drafted for the front, so they had to make to do with the few remaining. The small number of wagons worked tirelessly to transport people to the station. As they passed their watermelon field, they could not bring themselves to leave all the fruits behind. Some were picked and taken along on the long journey, a last farewell to the familiar life they were leaving behind. About 40 people were packed into each wagon. It was crowded and stifling, with barely room to sit. Then the train began to move. 2 locomotives pulled 53 freight cars carrying roughly 2,150 deported people. The train headed toward to Caucasus. German planes appeared in the sky. Guards ordered the ordered the deportees to wave white clothes during attacks to prevent the pilots from dropping bombs. Yet the train behind them was attacked despite these precautions. The initial destination was a collective farm. There, the additional laborers were welcomed for the harvest and given good food. My great-grandfather recounted that they were told it was only an evacuation. Once the Wehrmacht was pushed back, they could return home. Those most took very little with them. On August 28, 1941, Stalin issued a decree on the relocation of Germans living in the Volga districts, which soon extended to all German settlements areas west of Soviet Union. On September 28th, the order for onward travel arrived again. Roughly 2,000 deportees had to squeeze into a train, many in light summer clothing and sandals. By the time they reached Kazakhstan, it was already the depth of winter. For many, it meant death. My great-grandmother's sister, Helene Rogalski-Boschman, froze to death. My great-grandparents were taken along with relatives of my great-grandmother to a village of Imantau, northern Kazakhstan, a partly Russian, a partly Tatar village. In Imantau, hunger and disease prevailed. Typhus broke out and people died one by one. Cornelius Boschman succumbed to the disease, dying on July 7, 1943 at only 44 years old. When his mother Helena learned of his death, she suffered a stroke and died 6 days later. Granddaughter Elvira recalled seeing a team of 2 oxen pulling the coffin. Relatives and other Germans followed the cart, singing softly, "He goes home to the father's house. Who knows, maybe tomorrow." The locals, it was strange. The Germans are strange, they said. Where one must cry and wail, they sing. In Imantau, there was a large fish-filled lake. Fish brigades were formed from the deported Germans. My great-grandfather Peter became a member. Though he could not swim, he went out on the boats every time. Each trip risked his life, but the work as a fisherman ensured the family survival. In 1942, all men were drafted into the so-called Todarmee. Many were separated from their families and sent to the labor camps. My great-grandfather escaped this fate by a stroke of luck. A sympathetic commander warned him in advance and advised him to hide on the day the men were taken. Peter allowed this advice, avoiding the Todarmee. Instead, he continued to work as a fisherman on the lake in Imantau. In 1946, my grandmother Helena was born. In 1952, her younger brother Johann. In the 1950s, my great-grandfather received a permission to immigrate to Germany. Soon after, however, the KGB summoned him. There he was given a brutal choice, either voluntarily forgo immigration or go to prison. With a wife and 4 children to support, he had no choice. He declined the immigration. Until 1956, they were under the Kommandatur and get the revocation notes as special settlers. Yes, this is my family in the 1959. My great-grandparents, their 4 children, and also son-in-law Johann Hempel. He was also a Volga German, and granddaughter Nina Hempel. In the mid-1960s, my grandmother found employment in southern Kazakhstan because the climate there resembled Crimea. My great-grandparents, along with some relatives, moved to the village of Lugavoy in Jambul region. Despite all repression, they steadfastly preserved their language and faith. Plotich was still spoken in the family, and old traditions were maintained. This inner strength was evident in the next generation. Yes, this is the house of my family in Lugavoy from my great-grandparents. Yes, my grandmother Helena married against her mother's wishes my vulgar German grandfather Adolf Masson. Although religion was officially banned in many areas, services were sometimes tolerated in the 1970s. My great-grandparents and grandmother attended regularly, and my father also participated as a child. However, children's participation was discouraged. KGB officers repeatedly appeared, pulling the younger ones from the group. Older girls were urged to read fairy tales or speak about autism. This message was clear. The youth should be raised atheist, not in the faith of their ancestors. Since my father mostly grew up with his grandparents, he learned Plotich nursery rhymes from his grandmother. For example, Verguna Torg, Verguna Vetje nach Hos et immer noch nicht kon. From his grandfather, he heard the family stories, memories of Crimea, exile, and survival in a foreign land. When his grandmother passed away in 1978, German songs were sung at her funeral. By 1989, the first siblings of my great-grandfather immigrated to Germany with their families. A year later, in 1990, he himself, with his second wife, Maria, followed. In May 1992, my grandmother and my father also moved to Germany. This photo shows my great-grandfather with his two sisters, my grandmother and my dad. This photo was taken before my great-grandfather and his wife moved to Germany. Yes, this is a letter from my great-grandfather to his sister, Katharina Ziegenhagel. She also immigrated in 1989 to Germany, to Frankenthal. She also wrote with my grandmother letters when they were in Kyrgyzia. Yes, this is the family reunion in Germany. When, also behind them, my great-grandfather with his 3 alive children and their families. Yes, and this also in photos from the 90s. They visit a cousin of my grandmother, Martha Spence, with her and her husband Johann Spence in Germany. Yes, I was fortunate to meet my great-grandfather. Despite his harsh fate, the loss of his first wife, my great-grandmother, and outliving 2 of his daughters, he never harbored resentment, hatred, or bitterness. His daughter Lilia died in 1963 during childbirth of her daughter, and my grandmother in 1998 from a heart attack. Yet he remained a figure of quiet strength and deep faith, and also with a sense of humor until the end. Yes, this is a photo at the baptism party of my brother with my maternal great-grandfather Wilhelm Nachtigall. One piece of wisdom my great-grandfather passed down in the family was, "Kings come and go, but the people endure." Despite uprooting labor camps and discrimination, my family managed to preserve their identity, culture, and traditions. He passed away in 2006 in Rhineland-Palatinate in a proud age of 65. 2 years later, I began to explore my family history intensively, but that is another story. Finally, a short excerpt from audio records of my great-grandmother Katharina Sperling singing in the 1970s. I hope Am I good here? Can you hear it? Thank you for your attention.
In the Soviet Union. In this session, focusing entirely on the Soviet period.
53,000 Germans from Germany. His first wife, my great-grandmother, and outliving two of his daughters, he never harbored resentment, hatred, or bitterness. His daughter Lilia died in 1963.
So can you see my presentation? Yes? Okay, so hello everyone. I'm happy to have the opportunity to present my paper, even though I can't be with you in person. Many greetings to all my dear friends over there. I want to make a short reference to Troy Osborne's presentation, just to add that the Martyr's Mirror is having a great revival among Mennonite churches in Germany, and a new revised edition has been released just about 2 weeks ago in German. There are voices calling for a new Martyr's Mirror of the 20th century to tell some of the stories of those who suffered persecution during the Soviet era. Now, I have an opinion on whether this is a good idea or not, and what should be considered in such a project to avoid making it too hagiographical and as true to reality as possible. But for today, I'll just tell one of the stories that certainly would be part of such a compilation. I'm just bringing you into the Soviet Union in the late Khrushchev era, and telling something about the Mennonite and Baptist believers in Karaganda, and then come to the trial in 1962. So we'll travel into the 1960s together to have a peek into Mennonite life in the Soviet Union during the era of Khrushchev, who was the successor of Stalin. We've heard some about the persecution and terror under Stalin, so now we are in the era after that, which was called the thaw period, because of the so-called de-Stalinization, the release of many political prisoners, and also the release of all the German population from the so-called Kommandantur in 1956. So this is the guy I'm talking about, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. His reign was marked by this thaw period, by his attempt to modernize agriculture, by his policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, but also by some conflicts and crises. So, for example, the brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956, or the Berlin crisis, during which the Berlin Wall was built, or the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 that nearly caused the Third World War. So these two pictures are a reminder of that. And also by a new massive anti-religious campaign. So we see a poster from that time I'm talking about, 1962, showing religious people in a bad light, just to put it like that. Or this is also a propaganda poster against religious people. So now, how was the life of the believers during that time? Let's go to Karaganda. It was a big mining city in the midst of the vast steppe of central Kazakhstan, a coal mining city. It still is. So the city is pretty young. It was built only 100 years ago, about. And it's built in a place with rich coal deposits. It started out as a small worker settlement in the early 20th century, and then grew rapidly when the large-scale deportations of the 1930s started. We heard about this already from Maria Lotsmanova. So Karaganda was one of the places where trains and trains of those so-called special settlers were brought to as work power. In 1934, the place was granted city rights. The vast majority of the city's inhabitants were unfree special settlers, and among them were many Mennonites from the Ukrainian colonies and also from other Mennonite colonies throughout the Soviet Union. My own parental family was among the deported Mennonites who were brought here to Karaganda in December 1941. So the special settlers lived in sod huts or in barracks for laborers. And in these barracks were many believers who found each other, Baptists from different regions, and also the Mennonites who recognized each other very soon. And they started to gather secretly and have worship services, though this was strictly prohibited. And in the early 1940s, a Russian Baptist church formed that had services in Russian, of course, and many Mennonites joined this Russian church because they had no opportunity of forming their own church. But they still gathered in their own homes and had German services. Then in 1956, a number of Mennonites split off from this Russian Baptist church to form their own Mennonite Brethren Church. It started in December 56 with 21 members, but grew to about 1,000 members in the following year. So about 1,000 members during 1 year joining this church through baptism, and also many of them joined who were baptized upon faith earlier, before the 30s. So you can see the board of leading brethren here. You see many common Mennonite names among them. And you can see David Claassen, born in 1899. He joined the church in May 1957, and he was a very respected leader, partly because he was like a respected person, very good preacher, and also because he already had served 17 years of imprisonment because of being a preacher and a church minister. So he had already spent 17 years in prison by then. Remember him because I'm telling more about him. So this is David Claassen and his family in 1962. And this is a photograph that was taken during the celebration of Erntedankfest. This is something like Thanksgiving, but not like Thanksgiving is in America, but harvest Thanksgiving for the harvest. And you see the three preachers the story is about. The small one, the youngest one, is Heinrich Wiebe. He was 33 years at that point. In the middle, you can see David Claassen, the one I mentioned before. And the third one is Heinrich Zorn. He was from the Altai region in Siberia. David Claassen was from the Molochna colony, Fürstenwerder, and Heinrich Wiebe as well. So in summer 1962, so that means 4 years after this photograph was taken, the old preacher David Claassen and the young preacher Heinrich Wiebe were riding a public bus in Karaganda. When they were passing a pond where they had celebrated several baptismal services during the previous years, Claassen said to Wiebe, "The Lord has granted us so many blessings. Now we should be ready to suffer for him again." And this was soon to come true. On August 20th in 1962, the regional administration opened legal proceedings against these three preachers. Specifically, they were accused of illegal Mennonite activities, Christian gatherings, preaching, and raising children in the Christian faith. Those were crimes under the guise of religion, as it was called by the Soviets, according to paragraph 200 of the Criminal Code of the Soviet Republic of Kazakhstan. Heinrich Wiebe, at that time 33 years old, was father of 5 boys. You can see 4 of them on the photograph. The youngest one was a newborn baby at that time. In the early morning of August 21st, Heinrich had just finished his night shift at the coal mine and had gone to bed. It was 7 o'clock in the morning when officials knocked at his door and searched his house. You can see a sketch of a house searching. This is not this situation. This was drawn by Ernst Dück, but he also tried, illustrated the arrest of his own grandfather about this in the 1950s. So this is pretty close to how it would have looked like in the Heinrich Wiebe family. Officials searching the entire house for spiritual books like Bibles, songbooks, and photographs, and they found a lot. And when they found this photograph that obviously shows that it was taken at a spiritual gathering, they said, "What do we need more?" Heinrich Wiebe was arrested, and just a few minutes later, Heinrich Zorn was arrested as well. David Klassen was currently traveling, so he was arrested a few days later when he returned from his travel. The preachers were placed in the interrogation prison number 16 in Karaganda, each of them in a single cell. So they didn't know about what happened to the others. Heinrich Wiebe later told that his spirit was low after several days of solitary confinement, when he suddenly heard a voice singing a well-known Christian hymn. He recognized David Klassen's voice. The song lifted him up, and he answered with another song. Meanwhile, the 2 investigating judges, Darmenov and Suleimanov, were searching for evidence against the accused. When the defendants were allowed to see the investigation files, they found statements of about 80 church members there. At the questioning, the judges used false statements of the defendants against each other to exert pressure. David Klassen was already experienced in proceedings like this because he had spent so much time in prison already, and he refused to sign any document. From the house search until the court trial, he didn't sign anything. Heinrich Wiebe was much less experienced and later said that he made the mistake of signing some of the documents under pressure. He was interrogated every single day during the 3 months of investigation, every single day. The hardest thing for him to stand was the threat that his children would be taken away from him if he refused to stop his church activities. The court trial took place on December 10th and 11th in 1962. It was a very cold day. A huge crowd of fellow believers from different congregations, Mennonites and Baptists, gathered in front of the court, although the authorities had tried to keep the place of trial secret. So the rather small courtroom was mostly filled with believers. Those eyewitnesses who later wrote their life memoirs or published diaries all mentioned this court trial, many of them quite detailed, so there are a lot of sources. Heinrich Wiebe was the first to be led into the courtroom. He was strictly warned against speaking to anyone, so when Heinrich Zorn was led into the room, the 2 of them greeted each other with a slight nod. But when David Klassen was led into the room, he greeted his fellow prisoners with a loud voice, and he greeted them in Russian so that the guards could understand it as well. And he didn't give in to the guards who tried to silence him. In a lengthy speech, the prosecutor accused the preachers. His main charge was that a congregation had been founded in the city of Saran, the satellite town of Karaganda, and this congregation had been found without state approval. Church services had been held, and preachers had even been ordained. The latter was attributed to David Klassen, who was considered most responsible for this criminal activity. Heinrich Zorn's guilt was that he had been ordained as a preacher and church leader by David Klassen. had conducted unauthorized church services, and above all had prevented young people and children from participating in building the so-called bright future of communism. Heinrich Wiebe was accused of the same thing, but he was treated more as a younger follower and not as the responsible one. Heinrich Zorn was interrogated publicly first. His physical illness probably contributed greatly to his inability to remain steadfast and his willingness to make some compromises. So he gave in and agreed to not preach anymore. Then Heinrich Wiebe was brought before the court. He was able to withstand the pressure of the investigation. A quote from his memoirs: "I know that I was completely dependent on my Savior. The many prayers that rose up to God for us in the courtroom and in other places gave me the courage and strength to remain steadfast. During a break, we left the room accompanied by soldiers. A number of brothers were sitting in the hallway, including Otto Wiebe." Otto Wiebe was a preacher. "As I passed by, I heard him quote a line from a hymn, 'The faithful will receive a great reward.' It's a line from a hymn by a Mennonite poet, Bernard from the 19th century. The words touched my heart deeply, as Heinrich Wiebe wrote, and I can still hear them today." End quote. David Claassen was the last to be questioned. A quote from Heinrich Wiebe's memoirs about David Claassen's questioning: "He spoke decisively and wisely. He was accused of not allowing the sisters to preach in church. He proved it with the word of God, then turned to the sisters in the room and asked them if they were offended by this. They all answered in unison, 'No.' With that, the judge had a theoretical and a practical answer. Many other questions were asked of him, more than of me and Heinrich Zorn, but he was able to answer all of them decisively." End quote. For many of the gathered believers, the compromises made by Heinrich Zorn were considered as a betrayal of faith. But his fellow preacher Heinrich Wiebe regarded his case in a milder way. Quote, "Heinrich Zorn was released immediately from the courtroom. The fact that he received fewer visits from his wife, was driven to court separately, and was the first to be called to the public hearing was done intentionally, so that he would not gain courage." End quote. The court sentenced Claassen to 3 years in camps with particularly strict conditions because he had already been convicted twice during the Stalin era in 1936 and 1950 as a Christian activist. Heinrich Wiebe was sentenced to 1 year in general penal camps, and Heinrich Zorn was given a 2-year suspended sentence. This is a picture of the labor camp they were for their sentence. I'm quoting again from Heinrich Wiebe's memoirs. "After the trial, we were taken back to Karaganda, and sometime later we arrived at the prison number 16 together with Brother David Claassen. How happy and glad I was to have Brother David Claassen with me as a good teacher during the trial and now in prison. Since we both still had some food from home with us, he said to me, 'When we get to the cell, where there are already many other prisoners, let's distribute our food among the prisoners right away, because we can't keep it with us anyway.' So we did that, and the people were happy and well disposed towards us. In the evening, our new home, the small cell, was full with about 40 prisoners inside. 40 prisoners in a cell that was for about 4 people or so. There were only a few bed frames. Brother David, as an old man, was allowed to lie on one of them. In the evening, he said to me, 'So, Brother Heinrich, now we will say our evening prayers.' I wondered how that would work. Surrounded by so many people, it was naturally noisy in the room. He recited several Bible passages from memory, then sang the hymn, 'Befiehl du deine Wege, commit thy ways to the Lord,' from beginning to the end. It's a very long hymn with 12 verses. He sang all the 12 verses from memory, and we both knelt down and prayed. When the other prisoners noticed this, they became very quiet, and we were allowed to pray in peace. That was a very valuable lesson for my future life in prison. We were together for several more days and were able to talk about many things. Those were blessed hours for me." End quote. On the second day of the trial, the court opened a legal proceeding against preacher Otto Wiebe, the one who was quoting the verse from the song to the prisoners. He had been one of the witnesses, and now he was arrested as well and tried soon afterwards. He used the court trial to give witness of his faith and was sentenced to 4 years in a penal camp. There he died in January 1964, and you can see pictures of his funeral here, his 2 children standing at his casket and being followed by a huge crowd of believers. David Claassen and Heinrich Wiebe served their respective sentences. This is a photograph of Heinrich Wiebe's family during his absence. You can see the empty chair where his place would have been, and his wife and his parents and his wife's parents and his 5 boys waiting for him. And this is the reunited family after his return. You can see how he looked after 1 year in a Soviet labor camp. All 4 of these preachers are very well remembered by both faith communities, Mennonite Brethren and Russian Baptists, and both kind of claim them for their movement. I know most of their descendants personally, and it's striking that most of them are very active members of the Christian communities in their places. Many of them in my own MB church in Frankenthal or in affiliated churches. So far to that story. Thank you for attention.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Tepperman. I was saying to Ben earlier, it's very strange to speak to an audience of more than about 5 people, given the circles I run in, but it's wonderful to be here. So I come at this, I'd like to preface this by saying this is really more a story about Canada than it is about Europe. But it has many of the same themes as the previous presentations, and it's really more about the way in which Mennonites and Jews interact, what it means to have cross-cultural interaction when it comes to notions of justice, and it very much ties into this old Jewish proverb of 2 Jews, 3 opinions. You'll find that there's a lot of, really this is, yes, it's about legal philosophy. So generally speaking, I did not know a whole lot about the relationship between Jews and Mennonites until recently, but as far as I can tell, they get along pretty well. I found this article from 1969 on the left, by Homer Groening, father of Matt Groening, and ostensibly the model for Homer Simpson, talking about his growing up Mennonite in Oregon and saying that Mennonites are like Jews without a sense of humor. You're not allowed to blame me for that, he said it. And I also found articles about a rabbi helping out some Mennonite high schoolers with a fiddler on the roof, and nice stuff. Also, we have something of a shared history of Jews and Mennonites, especially in Winnipeg, having cross-cultural dialogue about shared oppression, shared stresses. There, 1995 and 1969, there were different conferences on this topic. I think they were both at the University of Winnipeg. Or no, one of them was at Manitoba. But this is a fairly moderate field of study. People seem to be in a good space. There is some tension at the margins. The 2 issues that seem to be the most serious forms of tension are over memorialization of the Holocaust and the treatment of Israel and its relationship to Palestine. And these are I think legitimate disagreements, but these aren't really major ongoing disagreements in Canada. There's really only been one major row between Mennonites and Jews in Canada, and it was over the treatment of Jacob Luitjens. Ben said Luitjens, I thought it was Luitjens, but you know. Luitjens is a tricky case because he really highlights the issues that come about when two groups that are sort of historically at the margins of society find themselves disagreeing about the nature of justice. Luitjens died in 2022 as a centenarian. And just a quick rundown of Luitjens here. In the 40s, he was a Nazi collaborator in the Netherlands. He joined the secret police. In 48, after the war, he was convicted in absentia and went to go live in a colony in Paraguay. 61, he entered Canada under assumed name and took a job at the University of British Columbia teaching biology. And for 20 years, it was sort of a non-issue until the Wiesenthal Center discovered that he was living in Vancouver, and it began an extradition process where the government of Canada, rather than taking on the issue of him having been a collaborator with the Nazis, sort of approaches it in the most bureaucratic way possible by beginning extradition based on the fact he used an assumed name to come into Canada. Finally, in 1992, he was deported and held in prison, and in 95, let out of prison but kept under permanent house arrest. This is a fairly straightforward story. We've sort of seen this happen hundreds of times in the last 50 years. The interesting thing, though, is it did lead to a sustained disagreement, a very severe disagreement between Canada's major Mennonite and Jewish communities. In Vancouver, the Mennonite community, I use this as shorthand, obviously, no group is a monolith, kind of came out on the side of Luitjens, saying that they'd forgiven him and that he was repentant. And the Canadian Jewish Conference held that that is not possible, only the dead can forgive him. And this sort of opened up a major philosophical disagreement that got very messy very quickly. So the problem here is that both groups had understandable claims, but their understandable claims may not have actually fit in with their own sort of self-professed cosmologies. So you had the chairman of the Mennonite Central Committee of BC saying it's unconscionable to send an old man away from his family. But you would also have the Jewish committee saying, well, what he did, he needs to answer for. And unfortunately, both of these kind of missed the point because neither of them acknowledged the fact that that loving him or punishing him was not really the issue at hand. So one of the members of his church mentioned that he was a good person and that it shows love to forgive him, and if you haven't got love, you've got nothing. But I hope you'll pardon me for zooming through this. The problem is that Luitjens didn't repent. He obfuscated, he said he didn't do it, then he said I did it, but not in the way you think I did it, and then he said, okay, I did it in the way you think I did it, but it wasn't that big of a deal, and this really is not something that either the Mennonites or the Jews involved in this discussion seem to grapple with seriously, which kind of made the discussion of it as a legal issue very complicated, as well as a philosophical and moral issue. it's interesting, actually. If you look at what Luitjens says, he uses the language of unaccountability, right? He says, I regret that at the time I had an ideology which I did not know would lead to the murder of so many people. Obviously, this is not taking any accountability. He hadn't personally killed anyone. He said he spoke obliquely about, like, this was in, 50 years after the fact. He is still not saying it was wrong that I did this. He's talking around it. And this complicates what should be a fairly straightforward question about whether to forgive him, because he's not seeking forgiveness in the way that either Mennonites or Jews would generally expect you to seek forgiveness. So it opened up this incredibly complicated moral question of to whom Jacob Luitjens was supposed to apologize, who gets to speak for Holocaust victims in accepting or rejecting the apology, and can Mennonites accept an apology on behalf of Jews? And I say this because I think it is also reasonable to ask, can Jews accept an apology on behalf of each other? Could I accept an apology for the Holocaust? That doesn't make any sense necessarily. We would have to interrogate that view. But it also opens up even bigger questions relating to these sort of foundational notions of forgiveness for both Jews and Mennonites, which is who gets to forgive, what is redemption, and is it okay to only receive forgiveness from God? And I say who's God with an underscore matters because Jews do not, theoretically, we should not be saying the word God. We say Adonai. You should not be representing it in text. So to that extent, even God is not quite the same for Jews and Mennonites. So whose God are we talking about? So I'd like to just briefly go over theoretically what the sort of morally consistent notion would be for Mennonites and Jews, and to point out that neither Mennonites nor Jews in this scenario kind of met the brief according to what we might expect of their ideologies. So Mennonites, I spent quite a lot of time looking up the notion of forgiveness, and central to this seems to be Matthew 18, where it talks about how people are required to take accountability, and if they don't take accountability, then you are in your right to disown them, to cast them out, let them be to you as a Gentile. It even uses the metaphor of the story of the slave who was forgiven of his debts and then demanded debts from someone else, and it was told how wrong it was to be punitive in this way when being shown mercy. So the notion in Matthew, theoretically, is that people should be forgiven readily and happily if they are eager to accept responsibility. And the Mennonite Committee of British Columbia says he did accept responsibility, except Luitjens didn't do it publicly, if he did it at all, and he also said things that ran contrary to taking responsibility. So we're not really on the right track here in terms of Luitjens meeting the brief for forgiveness. It should also be said that Mennonites are uniquely sort of gifted in the role of mitigating criminal justice. The absolute trailblazers in restorative justice in Canadian history were members of the Mennonite Central Community who in 1974, working as probation parole officers, started the first restorative justice case in Elmira, Ontario. So this is a very, like, the idea of forgiveness and restoration is a totally, like, understandable and reasonable notion to be pursuing here. But even if we look at this purely from the idea of restorative justice, were stuck once again, because under restorative justice, yes, people are supposed to seek forgiveness and people are supposed to become better, but you're also supposed to have stakeholders present, which means for Luitjens to meet the brief in this regard, he would have to be saying his apologies to people who had been directly affected by the Holocaust, which also didn't happen. So this leaves us in a situation in which we can't feel really good about the idea that Luitjens has properly taken account, but we also can't feel really good about the demand that he receive really significant punishment either, because that does not seem to fit into Jewish cosmology either. And what I mean by that is that there's a notion of teshuvah in Judaism, which is the need for repentance and the equally important need for forgiveness. And the role of secular punishment within this is a little unclear, but we got some guidance from the medieval Jewish scholar Maimonides, who says that sinners must abandon their sins, which I think Luitjens almost certainly did, remove them from their thoughts, probably, resolve in their hearts not to commit them again, sure, regret the past, maybe, reach the level where he who knows the hidden God will testify concerning him that never return to the sin, and verbally confess and state those subjects which he resolved in his heart. So Luitjens has almost met the standard of teshuvah here, which makes the call for severe punishment against him not quite fit with traditional Jewish notions of forgiveness. Now, you could quibble about how well he met any of these standards, but he's close on most of them, except the taking accountability. The interesting thing also is that there is a moral obligation to not only accept an apology, but there is also an obligation to absolutely not bear a grudge. And the idea that deporting a 70-something-year-old to a country he hasn't lived in for any number of decades because of something he did 50 years earlier is unrelated to a grudge, I think is a kind of a difficult argument to make. There's obviously some element of grudge in that. So is demanding that he be deported to the Netherlands out of step with teshuvah? Maybe. Perhaps more importantly, it's out of step with the notion of tikkun olam, which is a Talmudic notion about repairing the world and how it's the most important thing that for Jews that they do things that make the world better. This primarily takes the form of social justice or tzedakah, which just means good deeds. It sometimes means mitzvot, religious duty, but mitzvot is usually held as sort of a separate idea. But the reason I bring up tikkun olam is that everyone agreed that Luitjens was very active in charitable endeavors at his church. And if you look at the Mennonite Central Committee of British Columbia, they get pretty good reviews as a charity. So the question for Jews at this point would have to be, is the world better off having Luitjens sent to the Netherlands to live under house arrest, or is the world better off with him doing good works as part of this robust charity? And it would, again, be a fairly difficult argument to say that in any kind of substantive way the world is better off with him under house arrest, unless we think that he is actively going to try to do ill in the future. So we sort of smashed head to head in this philosophical quagmire here, right? And I want to make clear once again that Jews and Mennonites disagree within, as intra-group disagreements are common. So I don't want to make it seem like one group or another was speaking, in lockstep. They weren't. But it generally broke down into this disagreement. And the question for me as a criminologist is, what does this mean when it comes to Canadian jurisprudence? What can we take from this in terms of understanding the law? So I think the thing we need to acknowledge here is that all of the groups at play, including the government, were going after ends that they were not acknowledging were their actual ends. Everyone was claiming to be engaging in something more, either more moral or less punitive than what it actually was. So I would make a strong claim that in this case, the Jewish community was probably driven by the desire for retribution and denunciation, but was using the language of restoration. It was a restoration of society. Canadian society can only heal when we punish those who participated in Nazi collaboration. The Mennonite community of BC, I think, was also using the language of restoration by saying Luitjens was restored, but really they were saying, they're really talking about rehabilitation. They were saying he's not going to do it again. That does not, again, really account for the harm he's caused. So the third group whose views we want to understand here would be the government. And the government of Canada said that we're denouncing him by sending him to the Netherlands. But really, they were just kind of washing their hands of him. And that's what we might call incapacitation. They were just saying, this guy's not our problem anymore. And the ultimate issue here is that we see how poorly served groups like Jews and Mennonites are when they try to argue for justice using any kind of religious or non-secular argumentation, and how it actually works against the interests of both Jews and Mennonites to use religious justifications for their own ends. This whole case got me thinking of the sociologist Emile Durkheim, who talked about the nature of solidarity in society. He was living in Paris in the 1890s. It was a very multicultural society. And he said, why do people get along in a multicultural society? And he said, well, it's because in the past you might be able to get along because you share a religion, you share a race, you share family bonds, whatever. And he called that mechanical solidarity. But the creation of diverse and modern societies meant that we had to find other ideas to organize around, which he called organic solidarity. So ideas like justice and support of the underprivileged, the proper rearing of children, these big, broad ideas that people generally sign on to. And the problem in the Luitjens case is that Jews and Mennonites were both making arguments from a standpoint of mechanical solidarity. They were saying, we're going to stand with our side, which not only obscures the aim of justice, but is ultimately very harmful for both groups, as they're both sort of traditionally marginalized groups. I'm sorry, I rewrote this like 15 times. So yes, both Jews and Mennonites attempted to apply impulses born of mechanical solidarity in a secular venue, which is the courts. And I I think what this really gives us, I've been struggling to figure out what this all means, because I think it's a very curious case, but it really what it is a reminder that humanistic secular justice is not simply an important idea in some sort of abstract philosophical sense, but it is profoundly important for both for groups such as Mennonites and Jews both, because it is this protection against the tyranny of a majority that might otherwise be able to do justice along the lines of mechanical solidarity or ways that privilege their own group. And I didn't really know how to end this, so I just said questions.
Thank you, Alex, for a very thought-provoking presentation, and thank you to our other presenters for their very sobering presentations as well. We will take 10 minutes for questions. We've got 2 microphones, one downstairs and one heading upstairs right now. Yes, let's, there we have one.
Julia Thiessen. I'm actually not sure who this question is for. We heard some very specific stories, but maybe somebody can answer a general question. Alex, you said you expected ideological consistency of Mennonites, which was a surprising thing to hear. We know how susceptible Mennonites were to Nazi collaboration. I only know a tiny bit about Soviet era, and that is of the German experience, where Mennonites were also susceptible to communist collaboration. And in these stories of specific families experiencing oppression under the Soviet Union, we didn't hear anything in this about the ways that Mennonites might have also collaborated. And so I'm not actually sure if this is a question anybody can answer, but I'm just curious about that sort of absence in this. Anyone want to speak to that?
There are stories like that, but of course, like any collaboration with, with a bad government or evil people, it's kind of, swept under the carpet. So, yeah, absolutely there was. And you're talking about collaboration with Germans and Soviets. Is that what you?
Well, like in the Mennonite churches in East Germany, there's collaboration.
Yeah.
How large scale was it?
Well, it's a matter of survival, right? The Mennonites in Germany after the revolution and the communist takeover, they had to survive. So collaboration is a multifaceted thing, right? It's survival, living within your own morals and ethics, et cetera, right? And I would say there was a big disparity between the Soviet way of life and there was for the Mennonites. It was a total, turnaround of their values, et cetera. So, yeah, I'm sure there are stories, and we know there is, but again, it's, I guess victimhood is probably a bigger topic than,
Okay, if there's no one else. So thank you, all of you, for your presentations. They were fascinating. My question is for Alex. I was so excited to hear your presentation because I have done a little bit of reading from the Mennonite perspective on the Luitjens case. And I'm wondering a couple of things. So how did the context of the Canadian government going after, quote, war criminals kind of affect, this is one case, but it's a broader kind of movement at that time of investigating people, and that is also part of the reason why there's, I think, some hesitation on the part of Mennonites because they don't know where it ends. And and also from within the Jewish community, I know within the Mennonite community in like certain periodicals, there was a lot of debate about Luitjens specifically, a lot of for, a lot of against. Within the Jewish periodicals, do we see something similar, or is this something that is being debated within the community, not just by sort of a leadership And is there a difference between, obviously with Mennonites as well, there are people who are practicing Mennonites, so actual members of Mennonite churches, and then there are people who are kind of outside of that. Was there sort of a difference of opinion based off of those who adhere to the religion versus those who have a secular identity?
That's a terrific question. I don't, off the top of my head, know exactly how it broke down with the Luitjens case, but I will say that the general form of disagreement takes, as you say, the role of Orthodox religious versus secular or conservative, not as religious, and generally speaking, ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Jews tend to be far more conservative, so I think there would probably be a very heavy push within that community for the sort of the sniffing out of Nazis, whereas I think for a lot of less Orthodox Jewish communities, it is primarily kind of a socio-legal question about what are we trying to accomplish? Is this going to actually solve anything? I don't think anyone was terribly concerned about Luitjens' well-being, but if I had to guess, it probably was something that most Jews would feel okay with him being punished and deported, but primarily something undertaken by very seriously religious Jews. And that's just a guess. If I'm wrong, then tell me.
I'll ask a question. Maria, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a kind of a technical question probably to Naemi. I'm just curious about the case. Where is it deposited, in which archive, and did you have a chance to work with it directly, or was it from some other sources or something? Because the case is from the 60s, it's a bit unusual. Thank you.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Yes, there are sources, like one sort of sources are the memoirs of people which are accessible very, very well. So the memoirs of Heinrich Wiebe and the other people. But yes, my father had been to this KGB archive of Karaganda about 20 years ago, and at that time he was given, and he could get access to any file he wanted. So he took many notes and also some pictures of some of the documents, and also the city archive of Karaganda. So this case is deposited there directly in the city of Karaganda, and it was accessible like 20 years ago. And those copies he did then and the notes he took then that's the source that we can work with now. But there are many of them. So he has the descriptions of the investigating judges about this case and their perspective on this. And also a third type of sources are the other people who were neither judges nor like Mennonites or other believers, but people who were brought to this court trial because it was some kind of, I don't know how to put it in English, but it was to show to the people how the Soviet Union deals with people like them, with believers. So I later talked to people who were non-believers at that time, who were like teachers of schools or any other people who were working with other people who had to attend this court trial to learn about politics and atheism and so on. I hope you get what I want to say. So there are different kinds of sources and they are pretty much accessible. So this case can be regarded very detailed from different perspectives.
Okay, thank you.
I'll ask one question. I think all three of the first presentations, certainly the first two, mentioned the process of rehabilitation. And I'll ask this question to Waldemar primarily. What did rehabilitation mean for the families and relations of the people who were repressed and punished by the Soviet state?
I try to explain. Sorry for my English. For my family, it was my great-grandfathers didn't any crimes. They were unschuldig. English word.
Innocent.
They were innocent. My family knows them, but when they get this rehabilitation, most it was, in our case, for example, too late, because my great-grandfathers were deaf. So their children, grandchildren know he was not a criminal, but it was too late because he was deaf. It was, I don't know how can different explain it.
Can I add something? It's in most cases it was a moral retribution. Like, you know that okay, my grandfather or my great-grandfather was not a criminal; he was innocent. But in some cases, it depends on the place, on the city. In some cities, there was this organization called Memorial, which still exists today, but is forbidden in Russia now. And this Memorial tried to find the victims of this repressions, of the Stalinist repressions, and to help them, like to pay them some kind of social financial help or so. So, for example, my grandfather, who spent 10 years in a Soviet labor camp, he received, it was little, but still he received some kind of financial retribution in the 90s. But he died in 1992, so it was not a long time, but still it was like a recognition, a state recognition that the families have suffered innocently.
Thank you for your answers. With that, we will conclude this session. Thank you to our presenters coming in from Germany. Thank you to Werner and Alex. We will regroup in about 20 minutes for our keynote. There's coffee and cookies.